I once believed I could control everything billion-dollar negotiations, the pulse of the market, even the future of a nation if needed. But that night, in the suffocating snowstorm of Valhalla, a single knock on the door shattered the entire rational world I had built in an instant. Inside the cold stone mansion, perched in isolation on the mountainside, the firelight flickered against the surface of an $18 billion merger contract spread open before me, a deal that could launch RemCore beyond every competing conglomerate. But just as I reached for my fountain pen, the knock came, knock, 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 sharp, urgent, as if someone were trying to awaken the deepest, long-buried part of me. I looked up and stepped toward the security panel, and in that very moment, my heart seized. On the screen stood a woman drenched in snow, trembling, clutching a small child. That face was Isabel Hartley, the woman I had once loved so blindly, who had vanished from my life without a single word. Her face still bore the fierce grace I had fallen for, but now it was etched with despair, and her eyes, God, those eyes, still held. The only gaze that had ever made me believe all the glory out there meant nothing. I didn't have time to think. The door swung open, and the cold sliced in like 100 knives, carrying the scent of snow, the sound of shallow breaths, and a piece of memory I thought had died. I stood there frozen for a moment, then reached out and pulled them both inside without a word. I only knew one thing. Everything was about to change, and this time, I wouldn't lose her again. I still remember that feeling, just 3 knocks, in the dead of a snow-covered night, and yet it felt like my entire former world had been ripped apart. And if you think a CEO like me doesn't shake easily, then perhaps you've never come face to face with the eyes of someone you once lost, at the most impossible moment imaginable. I stepped toward the door, the security screen still blinking in the glow of the fireplace behind me. On it, a face appeared that nearly knocked the breath out of me. Isabel Hartley, the only woman who had ever made me consider walking away from RemCore, and the one I had let slip through my fingers because of one unspoken mistake. She stood there in the blizzard, soaked to the bone, clutching a tiny child shivering in her arms. I didn't need to zoom in. I didn't need biometric data. I recognized her in half a second. But what stopped my heart wasn't Isabel, it was the boy in her arms, a frail little boy, pale from the cold. And when he looked up, he had the same eyes I'd seen every morning in the mirror for the first 30 years of my life. I opened the door. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask what she was doing here. I only knew I had to pull them inside before the frozen world outside stole something else we'd never get back. Inside the silent mansion, the fireplace crackled softly, pretending to offer warmth. Isabel sat down in the chair by the fire, her trembling hands pouring tea as if letting go might shatter her entirely. The boy Leo curled up, hugging a soaking wet pillow, saying nothing, but those eyes wouldn't let me walk away again. My mind told me to push them back out the door. But my heart, the part that had been frozen for years, whispered one thing only. If what you're feeling is true, then you've already lost an entire lifetime. The Remington estate had always been the quietest place in my life, a sanctuary where every stone and every lamp had been designed to shield me from the chaos of the world outside. But that night, this refuge became a silent battlefield between the past, the present, and something I didn't dare name regret. Isabel sat there, still not looking at me. She dried her wet hair with the thick towel I had just handed her. Her shoulders trembled, maybe from the cold, maybe from fear. Leo, the child beside her, remained silent, clinging to a pillow like a life raft in the storm of life. I picked up a dry sweater, knelt, and held it out to the boy. Leo looked up at me, hesitant, but what made me forget how to breathe was those eyes. Amber eyes, deep, like an autumn lake, piercing, yet quiet, unmistakable. The eyes of the Remington bloodline. My eyes. My heart skipped a beat. I stuffed my hands into my coat pockets, and walked toward the glass doors, not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed to hide the earthquake unraveling inside me. Behind me, Isabel's voice rose soft, like a confession. I didn't come to ask for anything. We got stuck. All the resorts are closed, and the roads are blocked. I knew you still kept this place, and I had nowhere else to go. I turned back. Her eyes met mine, not pleading, not resentful, just filled with a heartbreaking resignation, as if she'd braced herself for any reaction I might have, even being thrown out. I said nothing. I couldn't. The only question pounding in my head was, why didn't you call? Why, tonight of all nights? And why, God, why does that boy have my eyes? Outside, the wind howled, as if trying to rip away the secrets buried for 9 long years. But inside this house, there were only 3 people and one truth waiting to erupt. I've stared into thousands of eyes, partners, enemies, lovers, even the most ruthless investors on Wall Street, but never once had I trembled from the gaze of a child until that moment. Leo sat by the fireplace, a wool scarf draped over one shoulder, hands clasped tightly around a mug of hot milk I had made clumsy but honest. He looked up at me slowly, without fear, and I saw myself, not in a vague resemblance, not a coincidence, but in a cold certainty that pierced straight through my heart. Those eyes were mine when I was a boy, standing before the storage room mirror, wondering if I was good enough to be seen by my father. They were the same eyes that reflected courtroom lights when I sacrificed family for reputation. They were my eyes before I lost myself. I blinked and stepped back. The room seemed to shrink. The painting on the wall, the flames, even the ticking of the antique clock felt distant. I looked at Isabel. She knew. Her gaze didn't flinch, didn't deny, didn't explain. Just a small nod, barely there, as if she had waited for this moment, not to confess, but to let me feel it on my own. I turned away and walked quickly into the library behind the hallway, the heavy wooden door closing behind me like a sentence passed. I leaned my forehead against a bookshelf, breathing as if I'd just escaped a collapse. But how do you outrun your own blood? I used to believe that unspoken truths couldn't hurt anyone. But now, 9 years of silence were screaming. In that absolute stillness, one question echoed through my mind. If he's my son, how long have I abandoned him? My fists clenched, not from anger at Isabel, not from resentment toward my mother, but I, the man who believed everything could be controlled with contracts, clauses, and lawyers. But how do you draft a contract with fate? My heartbeat still hadn't steadied when I returned to the living room, trying to act as if I'd only stepped out for a breath of air. But in that moment, it was Leo who shattered whatever facade I had left. He was standing on the armchair, an old photo album in his hands, one I hadn't opened since my father passed, the kind that held memories I had convinced myself were long sealed away. Leo turned each page as if uncovering a secret world. And then he stopped. "Who's this man?" he asked, his voice clear, cutting through the shell I had built for nearly a decade. I looked toward the photo he was pointing at, and my heart froze. It was an old picture, the edges faded. In it, my younger self, wearing a brown leather jacket, smiling shyly, standing beside Isabel. Her hand rested on her belly, her face radiant, like the late autumn sun. No caption, no date yet. The image was an undeniable confession of the last night between us. The night I had assumed was just a rushed goodbye without strings. I hadn't known that she had walked away carrying something far more valuable than any merger, more sacred than the crown of the empire I now wore. Leo turned to his mother, his eyes full of wonder. "Why are you holding your tummy in this picture?" he asked, innocent but devastating. The room fell silent. Wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass like it might shatter all. Isabel didn't respond. She looked at me, not for permission, not to accuse, but to offer something, a chance to face the truth, a chance to stop running. I swallowed hard, the past gripping my throat like a noose. Everything I had denied, buried all of it, was reborn in a single frame, a single belly, a single look, a single childlike question. No one said another word. But in that gaze, I knew the time for pretending was over. I could go on being Alexander Remington, legendary CEO, master strategist. But in that very moment, the only thing I needed to learn was how to be a father. From a photograph I should have kept by my side every day for the last 9 years. I don't remember how long I sat frozen after seeing that photograph. Not from shock, but from pain. A cold kind of pain, not loud, but one that seeped into my very bones. I looked at Isabel, said nothing. I didn't know where to begin, or if I even had the right to ask. Then gently, she placed her hand on my shoulder. "Alexander." Her voice was soft but clear, like a bell ringing through morning mist. "I was going to tell you that day. I went to the airport." I turned to her. Those eyes, they held no blame, no resentment, only exhaustion, the kind of weariness carried by someone who had borne something no one else could carry for her. "But the person who met me wasn't you. It was your mother." The room suddenly felt smaller. She didn't yell, didn't threaten. She just handed me an envelope and gave me a look I'll never forget. She said, "If you truly want what's best for him, then leave. He doesn't need more baggage." I went rigid, every cell in my body iced over. I had always believed I was in control of deals, rivals, politics, and the press, but the most important thing had been severed by a single conversation I never even knew happened. I didn't want money. I didn't want a title. But I knew that if I stayed, Leo would grow up in a family that would always try to erase him. I wasn't strong enough to fight alone, Alexander. Her voice broke. She turned her face away, and I could only stare at the space between us, where there had once been love, once been dreams. Now, there was only silence. A silence that felt achingly real. "Do you know something?" she whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "For 9 years, I never once called anyone the father of my child. I couldn't. I wanted to say I was sorry, but sorry wasn't enough. Because the years we'd lost couldn't be undone. Because she had raised a child through winters I should have shielded him from the first. And worst of all, I had left the woman I loved to face it alone, not because I was cruel, but because I didn't know. I knew nothing, and sometimes ignorance in love is more brutal than betrayal." I lowered my head, fists clenched tight. That night, I finally understood something. I didn't lose Isabel because of a missed flight. I lost her because I didn't have the courage to stay. I couldn't sit in that room another second. Not because I was angry at Isabel, not because I was drowning in grief, but because of something far more suffocating, an overwhelming rage at myself. I stepped out onto the balcony. The snow was still falling, white, relentless, as merciless as the memories that had just been unearthed. I slammed my fist into the frozen stone railing. Once, twice, until my knuckles went numb. I had always thought of myself as the one who stayed ahead of the curve. The visionary. a strategist immune to emotion. And yet, I missed the most important thing. Not a deal, not equity, but the chance to be a father, to be a man who was worthy. 9 years. I muttered, breath clouding in the cold. 9 years my son grew up, and I didn't know. Each of those years, I had sat in million-dollar boardrooms, stood on TED stages, and been named youngest global CEO of the year. But not once in any of those glittering rooms did someone call me Dad. A sharp gust of wind hit me, but I didn't turn away, because I knew inside that house was a child I hadn't even believed existed, and now that child was asleep, dreaming dreams that had never included my name. I heard soft footsteps behind me. Isabel. But I didn't turn around. I just said one sentence, maybe to her, maybe to myself. I spent my whole life trying to control everything. And the one thing that ever truly mattered slipped away in silence. Isabel said nothing. She simply handed me a piece of paper, a crumpled, childlike drawing. It was Leo's. A house, 3 people, and a single phrase, written in shaky little letters, my family. I nearly collapsed. That drawing needed no apology. It was an invitation: if you're brave enough, step in, be the father of your child. Not perfect, just real. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. But when the sun rose over the snow-covered pines, I knew exactly what I had to do. Nearly 3 a.m. The mansion lay in silence. I was still sitting by the fireplace, eyes fixed on the flames as if searching for answers in their flickering dance. Then a faint cough echoed from the upstairs room, followed by Isabel's worried voice. Leo, Leo, you're burning up. I shot to my feet, heart pounding. No boardroom emergency had ever made me move that fast. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw Leo lying still, his face flushed with fever. Isabel fumbled for a washcloth, her hands trembling so badly she couldn't wring it out. I knelt beside the bed and took my son's hand, ice cold, but his forehead burned like fire. Something primal surged in me, not the instincts of a CEO who had run an empire, but of a father who had never learned how to be one. Shh, I'm here now, I whispered, unsure if he could understand. I took the cloth and gently pressed it to his forehead, then wrapped him in the thickest blanket I could find. Every time he whimpered, my heart clenched tighter. I held his hand, placed that tiny palm over my chest, where my heart pounded with guilt and weight. I had once believed success meant standing atop the world. But tonight, in the middle of fevered breaths and fevered dreams, I finally understood what true victory was: keeping this child in my arms and never letting him grow up without hearing the simple words, I love you. Isabel looked at me, her eyes red with emotion. Not blame, not anger, just a gaze I had never known before, one of a woman who had been hurt, but still dared to hope. I didn't leave Leo's side that entire night. I sat there, his hand in mine head, resting against the bed frame, listening as his heavy breathing slowly softened. And just before dawn, Leo stirred slightly, and in a faint, drowsy murmur, whispered, Dad. I broke down. Not because he called me, but because he accepted me as his father, even when I hadn't earned it. As the sun timidly peeked over the snow-covered peaks, the first light poured through the grand glass windows of the Remington estate. Alexander hadn't moved from Leo's bedside. The fever had broken, and the boy now slept peacefully in his arms, a simple moment, yet one that made the entire world around them feel suddenly irrelevant, until the phone began to buzz. Its screen blinked insistently. Lucian, head of board, urgent. Alexander glanced at it and sighed. He knew one call, one nod, and the $8.7 billion merger would be finalized, a deal that would cement RemCore as the most globally influential tech empire of the century. He stepped onto the balcony and pressed the phone to his ear. Alexander, the board is ready. The representatives from Dubai, Zurich, and Singapore are all connected. This is the moment that defines RemCore's future. Lucien said, his voice taut with urgency. Alexander was silent. He looked out at the valley, still blanketed in white, but inside him another fire had taken hold. He turned back and glanced through the half-open door. Leo was still sleeping soundly, clutching his worn sweater. "Lucien," he said, his voice calm and cutting, "tell them I'm not signing." "Are you insane?" Lucien shouted. "You're holding the pen on a historic shift." "No," Alexander replied slowly. "I've already lost enough history in my life. Now I just want a future of my own." He ended the call and set the phone down on the table. There was no applause, no breaking financial headlines praising his resolve, just the whisper of cold wind across the glass and the quiet certainty of a heart that had finally chosen where it belonged. That morning, headlines screamed, "CEO Alexander Remington abruptly withdraws from historic deal. RemCore faces leadership crisis after last-minute meeting collapse. Alexander vanishes." What's the real reason? But only one place knew the answer. In the warm kitchen of the Valhalla estate, Alexander was slicing a pancake in half, placing the larger piece on a small plate for Leo. "Eat up, son," he smiled. "Today, Daddy's not going to work. Today is ours." And in a world where men are taught that their worth is measured by the size of their accounts, Alexander Remington made a choice that brought the world to a standstill. He turned off his phone to hold his son. They say the most ordinary days are often forgotten, lost between blazing headlines and calendar alerts. But for Alexander Remington, a name once synonymous with multi-million-dollar decisions and gleaming glass boardrooms, that day, a day with no meetings, no stocks, no signatures, was the first time he truly felt alive. That morning he made 2 mugs of hot cocoa. No Italian coffee, no premium espresso, like usual, just plain cocoa, hand-whisked milk foam, served in 2 simple white ceramic cups. Leo walked into the kitchen, still drowsy hair, tousled like a bird's nest. "Why aren't you going to work?" he asked, his voice small, like he was afraid to break whatever strange magic had taken place. Alexander smiled and sat beside his son. "Because today, I want to be a man who learns how to make pancakes." Leo burst out laughing. "But you don't know how." "Then I'll learn." Alexander winked. "Didn't you once say, 'Learning is the best thing in the world'?" And so their day began with a full-on battle of flour, eggs, and a stubborn non-stick pan. Batter hit the floor, one pancake burned black on one side, but Leo clapped like it was the finest feast ever made. After breakfast, the two headed out behind the estate, where the snowy expanse stretched like a blank canvas waiting to be painted. They sledded, slipped, and laughed until the whole forest echoed with joy. Leo taught Alexander how to fall with style. Alexander landed flat in the snowflakes, clinging to his hair, and for the first time in his life, he laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. At noon, they built a snowman, imperfect, lopsided, but crowned with a wool hat Leo took off his own head to give. "This is you," he said, "but the happier version." Alexander looked at the goofy snowman and thought to himself, maybe this little boy had just created the truest portrait of him in the last 20 years. As evening fell, the two sat leaning against the large glass doors, watching the snow drift gently outside. Leo drew swirling lines in the frosted glass, then scribbled 3 names: Leo, Dad, Mom. Alexander stared at the words, his chest tightening. because in that simple, unremarkable day, he had found something money could never buy: family. And maybe, just maybe, true happiness was never meant to be scheduled. As night fell, the Valhalla estate sank into a strange stillness. The glow of the fireplace cast warm, golden streaks across the ceiling, but within Alexander, another fire was burning, a nameless mix of regret and urgency. He walked to the old wooden cabinet by the library, secured with a code. Only he knew the date he and Isabel once met under the Paris sky. The cabinet creaked open. Inside weren't corporate files or rare possessions, but old letters yellowed and folded with wear. The handwriting was messy, unpolished, nothing like his contracts, but every word was something he had never sent. The first letter, written the night after they parted ways. If one day you read this, I want you to know I didn't leave because of money. I left because I was afraid. Afraid I wasn't enough for you. Afraid I'd fail with you beside me. The second letter, thicker, longer, had a line he had once scratched out, but it was still legible. If we ever have a child, I bet they'll have your kind eyes and my stubbornness. Alexander sank into a chair, hands trembling as he held the letter. He clutched it tightly, then suddenly stood heading for the living room, where Isabel was folding clothes, and Leo had already fallen asleep on the couch. "Isabel," he said softly. She turned. In his hand was the letter. "I wrote this 9 years ago, and now he's right there, with tangled hair and amber eyes that looked just like yours." Isabel froze. Alexander stepped closer, voice low and steady. "I used to think time would make me forget you, but all it ever did was teach me what can't be forgotten and what can never stay buried." Between them, no apologies were needed, no blame, just two hearts that had once been broken, now finding their way back to each other through a little boy who had no idea he carried destiny in his gaze. And in the place where the past had been locked away for so long, a new door creaked open, one that led to truth, to love, and to a second chance. The next morning, a private jet took off from the mountains of Valhalla, heading straight for London, but this time Alexander wasn't flying as a CEO or a billionaire. He was flying as a father, on a mission to reclaim justice for the child he never had the right to know. Inside the limousine, rolling down Kensington Avenue, cold sunlight streamed through the windows, casting light on Alexander's sharp yet composed face. The assistant sitting across from him silently stared at the cancelled board meetings, the paused mergers, and RemCore's volatile stock. But Alexander said only one sentence: "Everything can be lost, but not my son." The grand doors of the Remington estate opened. The elderly butler froze upon seeing Alexander walk in, no bodyguards, no announcement, just him. Inside the cold, memory-filled foyer, a voice rang down from the second floor, sharp, powerful, and unmistakable. "So you finally remembered where home is." Alexander looked up. Standing at the top of the stairs was Marjorie Remington, his mother, the woman who had once led RemCore after her husband's death, whose stare could silence entire boardrooms, and the woman who had bought Isabel's silence with an envelope. "I'm not here to catch up," Alexander said, his tone even and cold. "I'm here to tell you. I know everything." Marjorie didn't blink, but for a brief moment, her gaze faltered. Alexander began walking up the stairs, not threateningly, not in haste, but as if each step was reclaiming a piece of his soul. "You pushed her away. You made me believe I wasn't good enough to be a father or to love." He stopped in front of her. "I don't need the inheritance. I don't care if the name Remington disappears from the shareholder registry, but Leo will know who his father is. And he will not grow up in a house ruled by fear and silence like I did. Marjorie opened her mouth to respond, but Alexander quietly handed her a photo, Leo smiling brightly, standing between him and Isabel, one gloved hand raised high and covered in snow. "He looks like you," Marjorie whispered for the first time, without pride in her voice. Stubborn, but genuine. Alexander didn't respond. He turned to leave. But just before stepping down the staircase, he said one sentence that silenced the entire house. "You can keep the empire. I'll be the kind of man my son deserves to call Dad." The door closed behind him, and in that moment, the invisible chains of a lifetime spent under the name Remington fell away. The RemCore Conference Center in Geneva, Switzerland, once the stage for dozens of historic deals, was packed to capacity. Hundreds of journalists, investors, top scientists, and strategic partners filled the grand hall, bathed in the cool light of crystal chandeliers. The buzz was electric. Why had Alexander Remington suddenly called a press conference? Was it a new deal, a technological breakthrough, or a resignation? The microphone buzzed. Every eye turned toward the stage, where Alexander emerged, not in a tailored suit, with no strategic slides behind him, no grand introduction. Just a man walking forward, with sleepless reddened eyes, but a voice astonishingly calm. "Thank you all for being here today." He began, his gaze sweeping across the rows as if searching for something distant and personal. "I was meant to stand here and announce RemCore's expansion into Eastern Europe, or the signing of a $12 billion merger. But I won't be doing that today." He paused, took a deep breath, then continued. "Because today, I'm not standing here as a CEO." The room stirred. Alexander clicked to reveal a photo projected onto the massive LED screen behind him. It showed him, Isabel, and Leo standing in the snow, beaming, the boys' amber eyes glowing with innocent pride. A whisper ran through the crowd. "Is that his son?" "This is Leo Remington," Alexander said, his voice starting to tremble, not from fear, but from truth. "He is my son. He is the reason I walked away from a $12.4 billion deal. He is the reason I have decided to step down as CEO of RemCore." Gasps rippled. Camera shutters clicked wildly. Some couldn't believe what they'd just heard. And to mark this moment, he went on. "I'm announcing the launch of the Leo Remington Foundation, a global non-profit organization dedicated to children who've been denied the right to know their birth parents, whether because of silent stigma or the selfishness of hidden power." No one spoke. 1 second, 2, then, like a wave, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. Applause, at first scattered, then rising unstoppable. Elderly men quietly wiped their eyes. A young female reporter shouted, "You're an inspiration to fathers everywhere." Alexander stood motionless, but inside he saw a boy with amber eyes running through the snow, and knew that was why he had chosen to be a good man, instead of just a powerful one. And just as the applause had not yet faded, a voice called from the crowd, "Mr. Remington, now that you're no longer CEO, who are you?" Alexander smiled, stepping down from the podium like a man who had just set down the weight of the world. He answered simply, "I'm Leo's dad." Less than 24 hours after the historic press conference, headlines dominated the front pages of every major news outlet. Billionaire Alexander Remington abandons the throne for his illegitimate child. Scandal or new humanitarian icon. America's richest man chooses to be a dad. Television stations replayed the emotional speech dozens of times throughout the day. Online, the video of Alexander holding up Leo's photo under the glowing lights of the auditorium surpassed 100 million views overnight. But public reaction wasn't just applause. Some analysts criticized him as impulsive, damaging shareholder value, and causing massive losses for thousands of investors. Rival corporations began circling, eager to seize the market share RemCore had left exposed. Tabloid journalists resurfaced everything between him and Isabel, falsely claiming she'd had the child to reclaim wealth. And then came the harshest blow. A major talk show brought on a family psychology expert who speculated that Leo might suffer deep emotional damage growing up between the extremes of wealth and abandonment. Alexander sat in a small house in Lake Placid with Isabel and Leo. The television echoed with criticisms, but the boy kept laughing, rolling on the carpet, asking Dad, "Can we make another snowman tomorrow?" Alexander looked at his son and needed no defense. Everything the world needed to know was sitting right in front of him, with amber eyes and a smile that felt like sunlight in a winter storm. He whispered to Isabel, "They can stir up a storm, but the only peace I need to protect is the one in his heart." Then he did something no one expected. He agreed to appear on the country's biggest talk show, The Dignity Hour, where he wouldn't speak in stock metrics, but with his heart. And under the bright studio lights that evening, Alexander didn't avoid a single hard question. When the host asked, "Do you regret leaving RemCore?" Alexander simply smiled and replied, "No, I only regret not finding my son sooner." The studio fell silent, and across millions of screens, no one could find words. Then a new wave began. Fathers across America wrote him letters of thanks. A movement called Be Present spread, encouraging dads to spend real time with their children. And Alexander, once a symbol of power, became the face of something far simpler, yet long-forgotten fatherhood. But the journey didn't end there. It continued where Alexander no longer appeared on the cover of Forbes, but stood in a schoolyard holding the hand of a boy who looked just like him, ready to begin a new role, a real father. That morning, Alexander didn't wake to the buzz of a shareholder meeting reminder, but to the sound of Leo giggling in the bathroom. He quietly peeked through the doorway. The boy was brushing his teeth hair, a messy tangle, singing and striking superhero poses in front of the mirror. It was a scene Alexander had never imagined, a small life waking up inside his own home, not an employee, not an advisor, but his son. Isabel was making breakfast in the warm kitchen sunlight, spilling through the windows, glinting off her hair like a painting come to life, a portrait of what was right. Without a word, she set a small lunchbox and a folded handkerchief on the table. On the cloth was an embroidered drawing, a robot hugging a heart. "It's from Leo." She smiled softly, her eyes gentle but full of fierce faith. "He said you should bring it to work at his school." When the three of them arrived at the school gate, the kids immediately burst out in excitement. "Whoa, look at your dad. He looks like someone from a movie." One little girl tilted her head and asked, "Why does your dad look like CEO Remington?" Leo shrugged, pulled Alexander's hand down, and whispered, "My dad's not a CEO anymore. He's a superhero." Alexander gave his son's hand a gentle squeeze, his chest swelling with a warmth so real, so sacred, it filled a space that had long been hollowed by sterile boardrooms and soul-draining reports. He was no longer the man orchestrating billion-dollar mergers, no longer delivering keynote addresses to rooms full of investors, but today, standing in an elementary school courtyard beneath a flag, dancing in the morning breeze, he knew with more clarity than ever this was the greatest role of his life. He stood still, eyes following Leo, until the boy ran into his classroom, turned back, and waved, "See you this afternoon, Dad." And for the first time, Alexander waved back like a child, unfiltered, uncalculated, unguarded. No one captured that moment. No reporters were there. But if you asked Alexander Remington about the most important day of his life, it wouldn't be the IPO or the day he received an honorary doctorate from MIT. It would be this simple morning when he was called Dad. And that emotional journey wasn't over, because tonight, beneath a snow-covered porch, Alexander would kneel down, not to win back a company, but to win back the heart of the woman who had quietly protected both him and their son all those years. That night, it snowed again, not fiercely like the night they reunited, but softly pure white, like an unspoken apology from the sky. Alexander stood on the front porch, hands trembling, as he held a small velvet box. Inside was not a new piece of jewelry, but an old ring, one that had once belonged to his mother. No one knew that after confronting her in London, he had quietly returned to the ancestral home to retrieve the ring Isabel had once tried on. Back when they were young and believed love could conquer anything. Isabel stepped outside, wrapped in a white wool scarf, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw Alexander standing amid the snow-covered porch, golden light, warming his face, not the face of a cold-eyed CEO, but of a man raw in emotion, preparing to say the truest words of his life. He didn't kneel right away. He simply stood there silent. "I used to think success was whatever could be measured," he said quietly. "But you and Leo, the two things I lost, turned out to be what gave my life any real worth." He pulled out the ring and opened the box. "Isabel, I lost you once. I let you raise our son alone for years. I don't deserve to ask you again, but I'm asking for permission to be a little less wrong this time." Isabel didn't speak. Her tears flowed not from pain, but because her heart guarded for so long suddenly heard an old melody again. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice trembling. Alexander nodded. "There's nothing I'm more sure of than wanting to wake up every day to see you making coffee, Leo mumbling through homework, and our life simple but real." He knelt then, offering the ring, not as a man of wealth, but as a man who had learned remorse. And when Isabel nodded, the whole world seemed to pause, making room for a quiet acceptance. No fanfare, no headlines, just two eyes meeting and a whisper, "Yes." The snow kept falling, but in their hearts, spring had arrived. And this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new legacy, a new definition of success, where family is the center and love the destination. 1 year later, beneath the clear blue skies of Aspen Valley, the inauguration of the Leo Remington Institute took place in front of hundreds of attendees. There was no symphony orchestra, no red carpet, only genuine smiles and the hopeful eyes of children from across America. Etched into stone at the school's entrance were the words, "Every child deserves a future, no matter their past." Alexander Remington stood at the podium, not as the man in an Armani suit, stepping out from the glass towers of RemCore, but as a father simply dressed, holding his wife's hand, his gaze fixed on the little boy sitting in the front row with his new classmates. He looked up and spoke in a warm, steady voice, unlike anything heard before on television. "There was a time I thought I would leave behind an empire, but I've come to realize that what we leave behind isn't in financial reports or stock prices. True legacy is what we plant in the hearts of others." He paused, eyes resting on Leo. "I didn't create this school to make amends, but to begin anew for the children who've been turned away, who've been left behind, who've grown up without ever hearing the word Dad. I was once one of those who stood in silence on the sidelines, until a child taught me what truly matters." The hall fell completely silent. Some bowed their heads, wiping away tears. A journalist's hand trembled, unable to keep up. A former RemCore employee quietly nodded now, understanding why he walked away from it all. Not long after, Alexander awarded the very first scholarship to a 7-year-old girl named Ava, raised in the foster care system, never knowing who her parents were. As she stepped shyly onto the stage, clutching the certificate, Alexander knelt beside her and whispered, "You won't be left behind anymore." She smiled, and in that tender embrace, captured by hundreds of cameras, something real, something profoundly human broke the internet that day. No one spoke of Alexander as the billionaire who walked away from the business world. He was now known as a man who redefined success not as market dominance, but as changing the course of a single life. And when night fell, as the lights dimmed across the academy, Leo ran up to hug his father and whispered, "I want to teach here when I grow up." Alexander smiled. "If you do, then I've truly left something behind." And in that moment, a new seed was planted, of love, of responsibility, and of hope for the next generation. Outside the window, winter's snow blanketed everything in white. Inside the bedroom, only the soft golden light from the bedside lamp remained. Leo lay curled up under the covers, his eyes still wide open. He turned toward Alexander and asked quietly, his voice small, yet filled with innocent curiosity, "Dad, were you scared? When did you leave the company?" The question, simple as a child's breath, pierced straight into the deepest part of a man once hailed by the world as a genius of industry. Alexander didn't smile. He didn't deflect. He simply set the book down on the nightstand and turned to his son with the eyes of a man who had once lost everything and now found what mattered most. "Yes," he whispered, "I used to be very scared. I was afraid of losing power, afraid of becoming irrelevant, afraid that if I wasn't a CEO anymore, no one would listen to me." He paused, voice steady. "But then, that first night, I heard you coughing when I pressed my ear to your chest during your fever. I heard something no boardroom ever taught me." Alexander placed his hand gently on his son's chest, where a small heart beat fast and strong. "From the moment I heard that heartbeat, I knew I had only one job left in life, to live in a way that makes me worthy of being your father." Leo didn't say anything. He just tightened his grip around his father's hand. And then the boy smiled a smile so pure, so sincere, it seemed to slow the entire world for a moment. Because when a child smiles at someone who was once a stranger, what people see is not just love, they see hope. In that moment, there were no crowns, no executive chairs, no shareholder meetings, no soaring stock charts. Just a father and a son who had found each other again in a world that had once torn them apart. And as if the universe itself had heard that answer, the snowstorm outside came to a hush. Moonlight drifted gently across their rooftop like destiny, quietly nodding its approval. In March, RemCore officially transferred leadership to a new CEO. The 51st floor, once Alexander Remington's office, was ordered to be thoroughly cleared for archival. No one expected that the person returning to that space would be Leo. He was older now, with the quiet sharpness of a boy carrying both intellect and inherited hurt. As he passed the old mahogany desk, Leo's eyes paused at a drawer sealed tight. Inside, among faded reports and decade-old tech models, lay a single discolored envelope. On the front, nearly erased, were the handwritten words, "Never sent." Leo sat down, heart racing for reasons he couldn't name. He opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, the ink aged and soft, each slanted word instantly recognizable. It was his father's handwriting. "Isabel. Sometimes I wonder if you knew. After every argument, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was angry, but because I was afraid. Afraid you'd leave. Afraid I'd lose you. Afraid I'd wake up one morning and you wouldn't be there anymore. I know I was cold dry and obsessed with things that didn't matter, but not a day passed when I didn't think I should have talked less about equity and more about her dreams. I'm sorry for putting the company above love, for letting numbers blind me from holding your hand. And if one day you carry our child, my only wish is to be brave enough to become a father, not perfect, but worthy. The letter had no closing, no sign-off, no period, as if Alexander had written it late one night, then folded it in silence, too afraid to send it. Leo sat still. For the first time, he wasn't just the boy who met his father after the transformation. He saw the man who had wanted to change, years ago, deeply, but fell short by a single missing step. He slid the letter back into its envelope, smoothing its creases with care, as though mending something fragile and old. And then he smiled, not from sorrow, but because he knew the promise, written in that letter a decade ago, had finally been fulfilled. And sometimes the letters are never sent, are the ones destiny saves to reach the right person at the exact right moment. The whir of rotors rose into the sky, sweeping up the last golden leaves of autumn from the rooftop of RemCore headquarters, the fortress of power that Alexander Remington had ruled for over 2 decades. But today, there were no shareholders, no PR team, no speech, just him and Leo, 2 generations, 2 hands, 1 shared breath. Inside the cockpit of the familiar silver-blue Bell 429 helicopter, Alexander no longer looked like the CEO who once controlled everything. He sat in the passenger seat, turned to his son, and said softly, "Take it. The sky is yours now." Leo's hands trembled as he reached for the controls. He had never flown solo before, but the look in his father's eyes wasn't one of instruction. It was one of transfer. No correction, no hesitation, only trust. From above, the city shrank behind them. The glass towers and digital billboards that once lit up his father's name were now just shimmering reflections below. Leo looked out and saw the horizon unfolding while his father was closing his own chapter. The flight lasted 48 minutes, precisely the length of one of Alexander's old strategy presentations. But there were no slides, no charts, only memory wind and the rhythm of 2 hearts in flight. When they landed on the grounds of the Leo Remington Institute, a center for therapy, rehabilitation, and education for children with autism, built by Alexander himself, he didn't exit the helicopter immediately. He looked up at the sky, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. Above them, a flock of migrating birds flew past, forming a perfect V, like an unfinished dream, finally written with proper grammar. Alexander smiled quietly, then said almost to himself, "Sometimes the leader isn't the one who stays in front forever. He's the one who knows when to step back, so the next generation can rise." Leo didn't reply. He just nodded, and in his eyes was no longer the gaze of a boy searching for a father, but of someone ready to take the flight forward. In his own way. Late in the afternoon, the sun slanted low over a quiet suburban street, where the front of an old red brick house still bore the chipped paint of time. No electric gate, no security guards, no nameplate, just a low porch and a few flower pots Isabel once planted when Leo was little. Alexander stood at the door, hand resting on the worn wooden frame. He didn't knock, just stood in silence. Leo opened the door and led the way like someone who had lived there all his life. Inside, everything remained the same. The faded armchair, the dust-kissed bookshelf photos taped to the walls with old, peeling strips. Everything was small, old, and warm. Leo walked to the last room at the end of the hall, his childhood bedroom. The foldable bed, neatly tucked in a thin blanket, spread flat, and a small window, catching the golden slant of evening light. That sunlight cast directly onto the opposite wall, where pencil marks climbed with age. He ran his hand along the lines from Leo, age 5, near the knee level, all the way up to Leo, age 10, nearly touching the ceiling. Alexander stepped in, stood behind his son for a moment, then slowly sat down on the floor. He looked at the wall, then lowered his head. His voice was raw, breaking. I missed so many years like this. No explanation was needed, no elaboration. It was true. It was an absence. It was every night his son fell asleep without a father's voice nearby. Leo sat down beside him, leaned his shoulder gently against his father's. He didn't cry, he just said one sentence enough to heal. But you came the moment I needed you most. The small room suddenly felt bigger, not because of space, but because the distance between two hearts had finally been closed. No more apologies, no more what-ifs, just presence, exactly what every child needs, more than any gift. Outside the window, the sunlight turned amber. On the wall, its glow settled across the line that read, Leo, age 17. And Alexander knew he could never erase the years already gone. But he could do the one thing a father should have done all along, sit beside his son exactly where the boy had waited for him most. Spotlights illuminated the grand stage of the International Convention Hall in Geneva, a stage typically reserved for diplomats, professors, and CEOs whose words are scripted down to the final period. But today, no one cares about the official guest list, because the person stepping onto the stage was just a 17-year-old boy wearing a navy blue suit, no tie, and holding no notes in his hands. Leo Remington, once labeled the fatherless child in his medical file, now stood before thousands. His eyes not trembling, but shining with something far more powerful truth. He looked across the hall, pausing briefly when his gaze met his father's. Alexander, sitting in the second row, no longer the man of power, just a father waiting to hear his son speak with the voice of an entire generation. Leo didn't begin with a formal greeting. He began with silence, a pause so full the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. Then he spoke low and steady. Someone once asked me, "How did you deal with not knowing who your father was during your childhood?" He paused, then continued, "I didn't know how to answer, until one day a man quietly walked into my hospital room, wiped the sweat from my forehead during a fever, and whispered, 'I'm here, son.'" A soft sniffle echoed somewhere in the crowd. But Leo didn't stop. He stepped forward as if drawing the room closer. From that moment on, I didn't need a resume. I didn't need a business card. I had a father. Not because he was a billionaire, but because he chose to stay when no one asked him to. No one in the auditorium remained seated. One by one, from global education leaders to young university students, they rose not to applaud a great speech, but to honor a deeper truth. You don't have to be perfect to be a good parent. You just have to show up, at the right time, with enough truth and enough love. Alexander looked up, not in tears, but with something inside him, finally healed, not just for himself, but for the identity he once wore as power. Leo didn't just inspire a generation of students. He redefined what love means, what family can become, and what it truly takes to grow up not by titles or accolades, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. 10 years after Alexander stepped away from the financial world, his name no longer appeared on the cover of Forbes. No one tracked the net worth of the former king of RemCore. But at a small retirement home in the suburbs, where Alexander volunteered part-time as a caregiver, people still called him by a simple name, the dad who tells stories every Tuesday afternoon. At the Leo Remington Institute, a facility dedicated to treating children with rare diseases, there was a room named Alexander's waiting room. Its only mural showed a man holding his frail son on a hospital chair with a line etched below. Not everyone who gives life is a father, but the one who stays earns the name. During a conference, Leo, now a leading geneticist, was once asked, "What's the greatest legacy your father left you?" He was silent for a long time. Then he smiled gently. "My father didn't leave behind a kingdom. He left behind a world where a once abandoned child learned to believe in love. And that world began with the words, 'I'm here.' No bronze statues, no medals. Sometimes the greatest legacy is a decision not to leave a first embrace after a lifetime of absence, a quiet presence between two people who had missed each other for far too long." Alexander Remington wasn't remembered for what he built, but for the fact that he stayed. And when he closed his eyes for the last time in a peaceful sleep, he was still smiling, because he knew he had done the most important thing in his life. He became a father. Truly. Dear friend, if you're still here after 23 parts, then I believe this story is no longer just about Alexander or Leo. It might be your story, mine, or someone who once sat by a window for hours, waiting for a door to open and for a father to walk in. How many children have grown up not because they were ready, but because they had no other choice? How many fathers out there once believed that working hard and earning a fortune was enough to fulfill their duty? And then when they returned, they realized they had missed an entire world that had formed in their child's eyes. Alexander was once that kind of man, successful, disciplined, powerful. Yet he didn't know what his son liked to eat, how many times he had a fever, or how many nights he needed the light on because he was afraid of the dark. And then, with a single fateful encounter in a hospital where a fragile life was fighting for every breath, he finally realized he had never truly lived. Today's story isn't just about a man who left behind his throne to become a father. It's about a choice. The choice to love, the choice to say sorry, the choice to return even when no one asked you to. And perhaps it's also about courage, not the kind it takes to succeed, but the kind it takes to stay when every part of you wants to run away. If you ever wished for someone to take your hand and say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong, but I won't leave you again." If you ever wrote letters you never sent, or carried a silent what-if inside, if you've ever hoped, raged, or gone quiet, then this story is for you. Because sometimes the words never spoken are the very ones we wait a lifetime to hear. Because sometimes kindness doesn't come from angels, but from those who once caused pain and chose to return to heal with their own bare hands. Alexander isn't remembered for what he owned. He's remembered for what he chose to love, exactly when it mattered most. And if today you feel lost, uncertain, thinking it's too late to start over, then please remember, Leo once didn't even know who his father was. But in the end, he stood before the world and said, "I have a father," not because he was perfect, but because he didn't leave me when I needed him the most.